Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel, Vanishing Foods of the Americas, Coffee, Chocolate, and Quinoa, part of the Food Security series, made possible with the generous support of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and the Department of History of Science at Harvard. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available on DRCLAS's YouTube channel shortly after today's session. You can also check out our earlier talk on contested water at the US-Mexico border. There is a link in the chat to DRCLAS's calendar for other events. My name is Gabriela Soto Laveaga, and I am Professor of the History of Science and Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico in the History of Science Department. Before I begin, I would like to give thanks to the DRCLAS staff, in particular Mauricio Benitez, without whom this talk would not be possible. A few years ago, I was in Southern Sonora speaking with a wheat scientist when he casually mentioned that by 2050, we would need to produce 50% more wheat than we produce today in order to continue to meet the globe's demands. This simple statement altered how I understood my own work, and in some ways was the genesis of this series. This ongoing talk series seeks to examine the multiple meanings of food security by delving into the cultural, societal, economic, and environmental impacts. We seek to better understand how we as a global community can face current and future challenges. Today, we will hear how crop disease, climate change, land tenure, and local access to water, among other things, affect many of the foods we have come to rely on a daily basis. Let me explain how this panel will be organized. After all three speakers present, I will begin the conversation by asking a couple of questions. We will then take questions from the audience, but please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any time. You do not need to wait until the end. It is my real pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Stuart Mccook is Professor of History at the University of Guelph. His research explores the history of the environmental sciences in the tropics, as well as the history of tropical crops. His most recent book, Coffee is Not Forever, A Global History of the Coffee Leaf Rust, recently won the Agricultural History Society's Wallace Prize for the best book on agricultural history outside of the United States. His current project is a global environmental history of coffee. Stuart Mccook will be speaking today on Coffee is Not Forever, Collective Challenges to Coffee Production in Latin America.
I thought I would start today by just standing back and giving a rapid overview of coffee in Latin America, just so people have a common sense of what we're talking about, and maybe to frame some of the things we're going to be talking about, some of the issues we're going to be talking about throughout this workshop. One of the things that makes coffee a little bit different than the other two crops on this panel is it's in fact not native to Latin America, even though it is now strongly identified with that continent. Mostly when we talk about coffee, what we're talking about is Arabica coffee, botanically Coffea arabica, which is native to southwestern Ethiopia and was introduced to the Americas in the early 18th century. There is a second commercial species that's growing in importance in Latin America, in Brazil and parts of Central America, botanically Coffea canephora, known more by its trade name, Robusta coffee. It was introduced and rapidly spread through Latin America. One of the things that makes it different here that I wanted to stress is that it's a cash crop. Again, perhaps unlike quinoa or cacao, it started off its life as a cash crop that it primarily cultivated for overseas markets. Although in recent years, I would say particularly from about the late 19th century onwards, domestic demand in certain key countries in Latin America has become also a significant proportion of where Latin America's coffee crop has been destined. It has been a geographically mobile crop. It was introduced first into the Caribbean, into the French colony of Martinique and the Dutch colony of Suriname, and then from there spread southward into Brazil, across the West Indies, and then onto the mainland of Mesoamerica and Mexico. So it's a highly mobile crop. The other thing, and for a while I would say in the 18th century, the island of, or the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, was the world's largest coffee producer. For a brief couple of years in the early 19th century, Jamaica was the world's largest producer. And then from about the mid 19th century onward, Brazil has been and remains the world's single largest producer of coffee, often by far. Unlike a number of other cash crops too, the other feature I think that it really characterizes coffee as a commodity is that it is very diverse. It can be cultivated both as a large-scale plantation monoculture along the lines of this postcard depicted here, but it can also be cultivated very successfully as a agroforestry crop by small peasant farmers using their own labor and the labor of their family. So its history, its trajectory is perhaps significantly different than other crops like bananas or sugarcane, which have tended to have a history of large-scale monoculture. I want to focus on, with that introduction aside, I want to focus my talk on what I think of as the three historical collective challenges, not to say threats, that the coffee industry in Latin America is facing. Some of these are, of course, historical threats of long-standing, but just because they're of long-standing doesn't mean they're not real. So what happened over the 19th century was that global or production in Latin America expanded more or less in tandem with consumption in the industrializing North. And so it was kind of a win-win situation in that particularly the dyad of Brazil and the United States, but also more generally Latin America and Europe, consumption and production grew more or less apace. For those of you who know a lot about the history of coffee in Latin America, you know this is a gross oversimplification, and we can get into the weeds there. But as a general rule of thumb, that's what was happening. Come the early 20th century, when Brazil at this point produced 90% of the world's coffee, in about 1905, we started to hit the Latin American coffee producers started to hit a problem which has yet to be solved, which is that Latin American production and global production started to regularly exceed demand. And this chronic oversupply has in turn led to significant price instability, which has been a chronic problem that producers and policymakers in Latin America have struggled throughout the entire 20th century to control, largely through various state-led schemes to restrict supply, particularly from Brazil. You'll see the picture on the upper right of my slide is from the 1930s, when there was a particular overproduction in Brazil, and they resorted to burning their own excess production in order to keep it off of international markets. There was a series of control schemes. The Brazilian scheme called valorization aimed to withhold Brazilian supply. And then in the Cold War years, from about the early 1960s to the 1980s, there was an international coffee agreement, somewhat akin to OPEC, in which tried to balance global supply and global demand and thereby stabilizing prices. Being an agricultural commodity and subject to the vicissitudes of weather and other things, it was hard to make that work perfectly, but it worked. Let's say the coffee industry was relatively more stable at that point than at any other point in its history. After the Cold War came to an end, the International Coffee Agreement fell apart, and the coffee industry has resumed cycles of boom and bust. And in many cases, at least in the Latin American context, the prices growers receive for their coffee has fallen repeatedly below the costs that the money that they below their costs of production. The most recent crunch has started in about 1919. And this fundamental economic fact underlies a lot of the other stuff that has been going on in the Latin America in coffee production in Latin America. A second sort of wave of problems began, well, depending on how you count, I'm going to put it in the 1970s. There are older roots than that. But for a long time, Latin America benefited from this ecological imbalance, that because it was a crop that was exotic to Latin America, it managed to be transferred to Latin America without a lot of the diseases and pests that had co-evolved with it. But over the 20th century, some of those diseases and pests started to make their way into the Americas as well. The coffee borer, known in Spanish as the broca, made its way, I think, to southern Brazil in the 1920s. And then the coffee leaf rust made its way into Brazil and throughout Latin America in the 1970s. We can talk a lot about the losses, and I certainly do at great length in my book, but I think the other thing that I want to really stress here too is that it's not the impacts of these diseases and pests aren't just in losses, but also in the way that people farm coffee. Now, in addition to dealing with issues like soil fertility, they have to invest extra capital, technology, and labor in managing the diseases and pests that that are associated with it, which are often involve significant increases to the cost of production. The largest adaptation was what was known in Brazil as tecnificação, in Spanish tecnificación, basically a green revolution in coffee farming, which involved the use of high-yielding hybrid varieties, chemical fertilizers, chemical fungicides, and it led over the short term to large boosts in productivity, but it also left farmers very vulnerable to rises in the costs of inputs or falls in the price of coffee, or worse yet, both of those things simultaneously. So the diseases and pests gets layered onto the price instability. And then the third, I would say, collective challenge, which will be no surprise to anybody in this room, is climate change, which have been affecting all crops in Latin America in complicated ways. So in some cases, like in parts of Central America, part of the problem is just excessive rainfall, which has been a problem, I think, especially in Central America and Colombia. Whereas in Brazil, one of the big problems has been chronic drought. Another one which has been much in the news recently is increased frequency and severity of hurricanes, some of which have devastated Central America just in the last few weeks. Another more subtle impact of climate change is renewed outbreaks of diseases and pests. Just to take the coffee rust as an example, there are areas of Latin America that were historically immune or not really susceptible to the rust because they were high enough, dry enough, and cool enough that the fungus could not flourish. But as temperatures warm and as the climate gets wetter, these historically safe areas have become increasingly susceptible to the rust. This is a major trigger of what was called the Big Rust, which struck Latin America in between about 2012 and 2015. You can see here from the maps, this is from a climate projection of suitability change by 2050. And you can see the three maps on the slide here, which shows Central America, Andean America, and Brazil. I won't go to it in great detail. I'm mindful I have a minute. I am going to land this plane. And you can see here that the orange and red are landscapes that are currently in production that are going to be much less or less suitable for coffee production. You can see these maps are mostly red. My final point is that, of course, none of these things have already suggested the financial challenges, the diseases and pests, and climate change are independent of one another. And in fact, the biggest challenge that coffee producers face is having to grapple with all three of those things simultaneously. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you for staying in your time. If you could stop sharing, then we could.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I'm just gonna get my mouse up here and we're good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Continuing is our next presenter, and also it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Anarita Garcia Lascuráin. Anarita Garcia Lascuráin is the founder and director of Fundación Mucho, the Chocolate Museum in Mexico City. Mucho is an educational center promoting knowledge, communication, research, and creative production related to one of Mesoamerica's most important contributions to the world, chocolate. Initially trained as an architect, Anarita is also a chocolate maker who, in addition to working with Mexican native cacaos and other endemic foods, has worked with small cacao producers. Today, Anarita will be speaking about chocolate, biodiversity, and developing, rebuilding communities.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you very much, Mauricio, for inviting me to this talk. I am very happy to be here and honored to share with Stuart and with Marygold that are true experts in the matter at hand. As you were explaining, I founded Mucho Chocolate Museum about 10 years ago with a group of interested people, chocolate lovers. And throughout this time, I found that the most valuable aspect of working in a museum is to be able to reach people of very different backgrounds and ages, and to understand this importance of community. That's where I'm coming from. That is the greatest challenge. And from this perspective, I will be talking today, which is the cultural perspective and how we're approaching cacao. I'm very fortunate to go after Stuart because he abstracted pretty much many of the concerns that are happening in cacao production. So I will just continue over what Stuart said. So when one approaches the history of chocolate, you soon learn that it has been a complex cultural construction built over generations, 30 centuries of this. The word chocolate, which is now an international expression that can be understood anywhere in the world, comes from xocolatl in Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs, or Mexica Tenochca. So to give a little bit of background to this, cacao was a key element in all the aspects of life in Mesoamerica. It was used as preventive and curative medicine, combined with a diversity of herbs, roots, seeds, in a compound knowledge of nature and landscape management. It was a currency of trade used across the Mesoamerican territory, and it also had a deep metaphysical essence. The sophisticated development of cacao suffered its most dramatic change with the encounter of the Americas in Europe in the 16th century. So the history of cacao, like other commodities, as Stuart said, is characterized by periodical shifts from one region to the other for political, economic, and environmental reasons. In the 17th century, it moved from Mesoamerica to the Caribbean and Venezuela. It proliferated in Ecuador in the 18th century. In the late 19th century, it was introduced to a small island, Sao Tome, off the western equatorial coast of Africa. And then in the early 20th century, it boomed in the Bahia region of Brazil, and then later on in Ghana, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast. It is vital to understand that the migration of cacao as a crop did not always include this biocultural set of knowledge that developed over centuries in Mesoamerica. Before I started the museum, as I was still working hardly in the architecture office, about 15 years ago, a client approached us with the intention of developing a housing project in Comalcalco, Tabasco, an ancient cacao producing region. The site was a mature cacao plantation, so we were amazed by the beauty of it and saddened by the thought of bringing down a rich ecosystem and accommodate urban sprawl. Fortunately, the project didn't come through. So back then, 15 years ago in 2005, cacao was no longer a profitable crop in Mexico, and land was being developed for housing, particularly in Tabasco, to serve the oil industry that was at its peak. Tabasco is the main producing region of cacao in Mexico, about 70% of the production. That same year, Moniliasis was officially detected in Mexico. The most significant disease in cacao had arrived from the south and was expanding rapidly. Over the next decade, cacao production went down between 50 and 80% in the Americas. This reckless disease was hard to control. Trees aged, as did their owners, and new generations searched for more sustainable livelihoods. Moniliasis, or frosty pod rot, is a disease present in most of the cacao producing countries in the Americas, and it's highly destructive, the most destructive of them all. Except for Brazil, which is also suffering for a very close pathogen, which is witch's broom disease. Brazil went down from being the third producer of the cacao to being an importer. So when the disease crisis peaked in the Americas, cocoa production increased in Africa by 50% in the first decade of the 21st century. Simultaneous to the advent of cacao diseases and the loss of production in the Americas a new consumer market started in the US and spread to the world, the bean to bar, tree to bar craft chocolate. Idealistically, it started as a response to social and economic concerns, mostly because of the working conditions of cacao producers and their meager share in a multi-million-dollar industry. Over the years, it has become a new standard of quality in chocolate, aimed at a small market niche and the only possible course for a politically correct bar. Conscious consumers no longer want homogeneous industrialized chocolate, but are seeking to savor the natural characteristics of the terroir and to learn the history of the producer in an effort to guarantee traceability and fair trade. The concept of cacao is changing from a commodity to a personal history. Fine flavored cacaos from Mexico and Central America, which were forgotten in this time span of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, came back to light. And criollo or native varietals are being searched in an effort to discover new flavors from ancient genetics. With subtler flavors than the African forasteros, which account for 70-something% of the cacao production in the world, criollos are more vulnerable to disease and lower yielding. So we are challenged with a delicate balance between scientists' efforts for higher yielding, disease-resistant genotypes and the conservation of native cacaos. With the current green revolution and our awareness of climate change, agroforestry systems are being implemented in the Americas. Cacao has become an agent for reforestation in the 21st century. So these necessary environmental efforts are hard and require a whole new outlook on the global chocolate industry and the prices of biodiversity-friendly, fair-traded cacao. Most of the cacao producers in the Americas are mega diverse countries. Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, Brazil, all harboring a high concentration of biodiversity in ecosystems that are under threat. In Mexico, this natural wealth has allowed for the conjunction of two universes, the natural and the man-made. This knowledge over nature is the result of collective practices perfected over a period of almost 9,000 years. It's the place of domestication of many of the species we consume, and constitutes an enormous legacy and really the substance of Mexico's biocultural patrimony. Last Monday, 2 days ago, was the 10th anniversary of the declaration of traditional Mexican cuisine as intangible cultural heritage of humanity by UNESCO. We were all celebrating this a couple of days ago. So this vast collection of practices comes from bioculture and encompasses more than we can mathematically account for. And it's also very recent, the whole concept, in our collective appreciation. It is through flavor that we can contemplate nature and man, and we can actually savor biodiversity. Chocolate is the highest expression of this. So in our role as a museum, we have made an effort to work on several projects that recognize the value of bioculture and what I think we should be looking towards facing the diseases and the problems that we're facing with the loss of foods in the Americas. The most notable project that we did was that we organized the first Mesoamerican biodiversity-friendly cacao award 2 years ago, an initiative from CONABIO, the National Commission for the Use and Knowledge of Biodiversity in Mexico, and in collaboration with Conservation International. In the map in your screen, you're seeing the countries that form part of the Mesoamerican biological corridor. And these are the countries that participated in the award. So the purpose was to identify the best flavors in Mesoamerican cacaos produced with biodiversity-friendly practices and help these cacao somehow stand out in consumer markets and get a better value. Other projects that we've done thinking about biodiversity and culture, we made a collaboration with the Natural History Museum in Mexico, and we are forming an entomological collection with insects that live in cacao plantations. This has derived in a different understanding of biodiversity for the public of all ages, particularly kids, and has also inspired art production in the museum, including the creation of chocolate combinations with edible insects. As you know, entomophagia is still very much in use in Mexico and probably one of the future foods of humanity. And last, after 5 months of closure of the museum because of the pandemic, we were able to open our doors again in September with a new exhibition. For the first time in history, and with a generous contribution of native speakers, 2 classic Mexica cacao poems of the 14th century were translated into 12 contemporary indigenous languages. The people that generously helped us are people in Mexico that speak this vast array of languages. Because of the pandemic, we had to transition from our touch and smell installations to sound. And we are aiming to complete as many translations as possible. In Mexico, a mega diverse and multicultural place where the world chocolate comes from. And here I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anarita, for that wonderful presentation. I would like to remind you to please write your questions in the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Don't wait until the end of the talks. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to present Marygold Walsh-Dilley, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of New Mexico. Using political, ecological, feminist, and decolonial approaches, her work focuses on agrarian change and climate change, primarily in the Andes region of South America. She has worked with and alongside quinoa producers for 2 decades. She holds a master's degree in applied economics and a PhD in developmental sociology from Cornell University. Today, Marygold Walsh-Dilley will be speaking to us about quinoa's uncertain future. Marygold?
So thanks for having me here today, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's interesting for me as a scholar of quinoa to be on a panel with chocolate and coffee, because these 2 crops were stars of the Columbian exchange, that monumental movement of people, crops, animals, and biological materials between the old world and the new world. Chocolate, of course, moved, as we've heard, moved west to east, and coffee came the other way. But an interesting fact of quinoa's history, and something that has strongly shaped its production and distribution over the past nearly 500 years, is that it was not one of the crops that successfully made this transition. It was not spread around the globe with the Columbian exchange. In fact, quite the opposite. Quinoa was, in the colonial period, marginalized and pushed aside through a process of culinary colonialism that favored European grains like wheat. Other foods were also subject to this colonial strategy that elevated European foods over indigenous American ones, and other crops have been lost, or nearly so. But quinoa is unique because, first of all, of how important the crop was to Andean people, both before the conquest and since, and secondly, because it has emerged as such an important crop globally in recent decades. And so I think that quinoa's story and history has important lessons for us as we think about how to build the kind of food systems that we want, food systems that are both ecologically sustainable and socially just. So sometime over the past 500 years, and this is one of the things that I'm doing research on, but in this time, quinoa became associated in the Andes with indigeneity. It was called a comida del indio, within a context of deep racial hierarchies that mobilized this term, indio, as a derogatory phrase of exclusion. As indigenous groups were often excluded from the best lands, often through the enclosure of haciendas, or lands were otherwise stolen and sold, quinoa became a very important crop to ensure the livelihoods of indigenous people as they were pushed into higher elevations or onto more marginal lands. Quinoa is extraordinary in a few ways, in a couple of ways, which helped these indigenous communities subsist and reproduce themselves even under such difficult conditions. So agronomically, quinoa is unusually tolerant to drought conditions, to poor quality soils, and in particular salinity in the soils, And it also is also frost tolerant. And so you can see as these communities were pushed further and further up in terms of the elevation and onto further, more and more marginal lands, you can see how this is uniquely adapted for those needs. Quinoa also is superlative nutritionally as well. It offers a complete protein alongside other nutritional benefits. And so both of these features help quinoa become an important part of the subsistence strategies of indigenous folks that were excluded from the emerging national cultures and economies. But quinoa was husbanded by these communities. It was protected and conserved by these subsistence strategies. At the same time, however, its connotation as an Indian food meant that it was always excluded from regional economies, and there was really no market for quinoa until very recently. Okay, so fast forward to the early 1980s. In the late 70s and 80s, we started to see that in the Salar region of Bolivia, this is the area around the Uyuni salt flat, here, indigenous producers of quinoa started to form cooperatives and community self-help organizations with the goal of supporting the production of quinoa, of course, but most importantly, of especially finding markets where quinoa could be sold. These local groups connected with development-minded individuals and groups in the global north, in North America in particular, trying to find ways to open up markets in North America. These groups, these development practitioners and groups, thought that if they could open up markets to quinoa in North America, it would help these poor indigenous communities in Bolivia and Latin America and South America in a couple of different ways. First of all, it would provide markets for their crops, obviously giving some income where primarily it had been, economies had been focused around subsistence. But secondly, they thought that if they could introduce quinoa to North American consumers, that it would help change the reputation of quinoa so that local people could begin to eat more of it. One of the big things is that there was this incredible resource, quinoa, but there was such endemic food insecurity throughout Bolivia, but they wouldn't turn to quinoa often. And so the idea was that if Americans, these most modern and most sophisticated of consumers would eat it, they might also start to eat it in Bolivia. And I'm of course not saying that this was, that this also had a fair amount of kind of colonial paternalism in it as well. So some of these same ideas continue on. So it did take some time, but they ended up being quite successful. Led by Producers Association, quinoa was commercialized under a fair trade model. And for the first 2 decades, this fair trade model dominated all quinoa markets. This tended to give local indigenous producers a lot more control over and the benefits from quinoa commercialization. And demand for quinoa did grow over this time and production expanded. So you can see from this figure that the FAO starts to track the price of quinoa only beginning in 1991. And this of course reflects the fact that there wasn't enough trade even to have a price to track before this time. So before this point, there wasn't even an established price. And as you can see between in the first 15 to 20 years, there was a relatively decent and stable price. It was low, but it was stable. And families in Bolivia benefited. You could see that development indices improving, right? You see that there is a reduction in poverty, an increase in nutrition, increase in education, a return migration. So they shifted primarily from a subsistence livelihood based on quinoa, potatoes, and llama, coupled without migration, to a market-based livelihood that specialized in quinoa, but also involved a whole lot less migration as people started to move back home. In 2007, right around the time when you can start to see that little spike that goes up, it became a little bit more popularized through celebrity chefs. Celebrity chefs sort of brought quinoa into kind of new populations, fitting right in with the gluten-free trend and this sort of interest in exotic foods. So you can see that there's a spike after this starts to happen. After this point, as Stuart already mentioned, the price of these kinds of agricultural commodities becomes often quite volatile. And so you start to see it become increasingly volatile as it's more fully commodified. Another thing that happens is that as the price sort of does rise in some periods, you start to see an expansion of production to other parts of the world. In 2013, an interesting thing happens in that the United Nations, FAO of the United Nations declared 2013 the International Year of Quinoa. What they were seeking to do was to bring attention to quinoa as a potential food for food security within the context of climate change. They were thinking that the agronomic and nutritional profiles that I mentioned earlier, especially drought and salt tolerance, meant that quinoa could be a key to climate adaptive agriculture. And so highlighting it in 2013 was intended to bring attention to and spur on research and development to improve quinoa further. And so that you can see in this figure with its price, you can see that there was a new wave of excitement and demand for quinoa that's reflected in the market prices. And then after that has happened, the price volatility has become so difficult that, similar to what Stuart mentioned, is that sometimes it's very difficult for producers because the price will fall below the cost of production, and that becomes very difficult. So this session is titled Vanishing Foods of the Americas, but quinoa is not vanishing. In fact, quite the opposite. Quinoa has finally, firmly arrived on the global food scene. When I started working with quinoa producers in Bolivia around 20 years ago, quinoa was virtually unknown around the world. It was only known in very niche health food scenes. But now it is both consumed and produced in many locations around the globe. And it's starting to make inroads into processed food as well, much beyond this health food niche it first occupied. And all signs suggest that quinoa is poised to become very important in the near future. So since 2013, there's been a lot more investment into quinoa as a climate smart technology and potential solution for food security. One of the most important areas of research is within quinoa's genome. So in 2017, the genome of quinoa was mapped for the first time completely. And what they're doing is looking for these useful genetic traits, in particular things like salt or drought tolerance, to try to find the genetic locations of these so that they can maybe continue to improve quinoa, but also potentially to move these genetic traits, these genes into other crops to make them also more climate adaptive. So like putting salt tolerance into tomatoes, for instance. So what does the future hold for quinoa? It has gone from being endemic in the marginalized indigenous communities of the Highland Andes to the labs and test plots of universities around the globe. It has gone from being a subsistence crop excluded from regional markets to a global commodity adapted for industrialized production by farmers also around the globe. But my question is, will quinoa remain an indigenous food that is uniquely suited to support smallholder subsistence and livelihoods? Or will the benefits from this historically indigenous crop simply be extracted, exploited, and expropriated in a continuation of the colonial practices of yore? I think that it's a really exciting time to be studying quinoa because over the next few years, we'll be able to answer these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marygold, and for being right on time. I want to remind the audience that you can begin to put your questions. I see some are already coming in the Q&A tab. And we'll start the conversation off with a question for all of the panelists. I was really interested that, of course, you all mentioned the impact of climate change, and it's undeniable in your presentations on cacao, coffee, and quinoa. And yet, as we know, climate change on the ground affects each crop differently. Could you explain one or two specific ways in which climate change is affecting your crop and the communities associated with it? Why don't we start with you, Stuart?
One of the big things recently was this big rust outbreak, which in Guatemala in about 2012, 2013, 2014 led to widespread unemployment. There was less coffee to harvest, and what coffee there was left to harvest was often paid at a lower wage. And so a lot of particularly families of people who would harvest coffee for the landowners found themselves in positions of acute food insecurity, both because of the disease, but also because simultaneously Guatemala was hit with a drought which meant that they were both losing their ability to earn an income, but also losing an ability to produce their own food. So that's just one example of many, but it's the kind of thing that was going on.
Very interesting. Anarita, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the floods that we're suffering in Tabasco in the past couple of weeks, which have been really bad for cacao producers because the crop, yet another problem of climate change. With the delayed rains, the crop won't happen like it usually was in November and December, but it's gonna move on all the way to January or February. So this is a change because of climate, change, you know, of the crop patterns. And something very interesting that also I think concerns Stuart is that one of Conservation International's projects is that they're now going into cacao plantations and shifting to, coffee plantations and shifting to cacao because of the rise in temperature. So they are doing this big project in Oaxaca in Mexico, which used to be a pre-Hispanic site for cacao production, then stopped being so for the following centuries, all the way until now, the 21st century, in which cacao is being substituted for cocoa plantations. So those are three examples of very evident climate change in cacao production in Mexico.
Oh, that's fascinating. How about you, Marygold?
Yeah, of course, climate change has really affected quinoa producers. On one hand, it's an opportunity because quinoa is seen as a climate adaptive crop, and so it's being adapted and expanding production around the globe. But for the producers in Bolivia with whom I work, in 2015 to 2017, there was a drought, and it was a drought in 25 years. I'm sure many of the people who are listening know about this. And it was such a difficult drought that you do see that there was some real crop failures with quinoa production. But I have a paper that I just sort of recently gotten published that kind of examines maybe the political ecology of this a little bit more to understand why it is that in previous years there were droughts, there were similar extensive droughts, and similarly to this one in the past, but it hasn't had such an economic consequence. And it has a lot to do with a couple of different things. Well, first of all, a big thing that happens is that price volatility that both Stuart and I talked about is that it also coincided, this drought coincided with very low production, real crop failures, coincided with a period in which the cost of quinoa, the price that they could receive fell below the cost of production. So that was a double whammy, right? Some people call this sort of the double exposure. But in my work, I also look at some of the other ways that these producers become even more vulnerable to things like market volatility or like climate change. So for instance, the kinds of production methods that have been used, really extensive production methods, mean that the soil fertility has really been diminished. The soil fertility, but then also the ability of the soil to harbor the moisture over time, right? And so as we have less moisture, but also we have an inability of the soils to sort of hold on to the moisture at the same time. And another big thing for the producers that I work with is that as they're increasingly incorporated into more market economies, they've taken on debt. And when they've taken on debt, what this means is that they must sell quinoa on the market every single year. Whereas in previous years, they might have withstood 1 or even 2 bad years of quinoa by just keeping the quinoa they have and eating that for sort of a subsistence use. They can't do that anymore. When they have to service their debt, they must have cash. And so what that ends up happening is it's not just the drought, and it's not just the climate change, and it's not just the market volatility, but all of these other things that create these vulnerabilities mean that there is so much more food insecurity as a result of the drought in ways that they hadn't had before, even when they did have drought.
Thank you, each of you, for really placing vulnerabilities and how that looks on the ground for each of these crops. I wanted to follow up with a different question, and this has to do with labor. Recent news reports have shown child labor and slavery linked with chocolate production. Could you give us some specifics about the labor required in your crop production and how that has shifted in recent years, and what violations are happening at various levels and how the communities have responded or found solutions on the ground to push back against some of these practices. How about Anarita, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. Well, that's like the topic in cacao production in the past decade. And it comes pretty much because of the practices in Africa. So if we think about cacao production in the Americas, it's very different. Most of the countries in the Americas have already gone through an agrarian reform. And there are structures, for example, in Mexico, like the ejidos, that have allowed for an organization of people that is very, very good for cacao production. So the concern for child labor doesn't apply for the Americas, at least not that we know of. And most of the cacao plots are about 2 to 3 hectares. So they're very small and they're family owned. So children do participate in the work, but it's usually a formula of going to school in the morning and then in the afternoon being present in the plantation as this cultural heritage for many, many centuries. Now, in Africa, the labor problem is very, very important because of migration and because of the extension of land and the forms of cacao production, which are more dominated by companies, even though also the cacao plots are small, but the trade is completely different as in Mexico. So it is a big concern in the cacao industry, and I think it's been a catalyst to what's coming for the next decade.
Thank you so much. Would either of you want to add something? Stuart, Marygold? Okay. So if not, Stuart, were you going to add something?
I was just going to say that I think the situation for coffee is a lot like what Rita described for cacao, in the sense for people, the big labor for coffee comes at the harvest season, which is fairly focused. And in that case, I think often domestically, students historically would, or I should say children would do it as almost part of a cultural ritual. But it also is true that in many cases, coffee is harvested by migrant labor. For example, Nicaraguans in Costa Rica or Guatemalans working in Mexico. And those children often travel along with their mothers, and their mothers might be hired as coffee pickers, but then the mothers bring the children out into the field with them, and maybe they're not registered in school, and maybe they fall behind the wayside. But from what I've been reading also, I'd say the rates of child labor in Latin America are, with the active intervention of states and NGOs, are decreasing over the years. So it's not such a problem as what you would hear in African chocolate, but it's still, I don't want to say it's not a problem at all.
Thank you.
Similarly, in quinoa, family production often brings children into it, particularly at high points. Planting and harvest are the periods of high need. But one of the things that's really interesting to me and unique about quinoa producers is that there's a really strong history of mutual aid. And so you might have producers who will rotate between farms and fields and households as they are assisting each other. That was a really strong, you saw that very strongly when I started working about 20 years ago on this. And then as it's been more commodified and as the producers have more cash that's available, they will hire migrant labor a lot more. But in periods of real need, they fall back on these mutual aid and reciprocal labor sharing practices that they've done before.
Wonderful. Before turning to the many, many questions that we have in the Q&A, I wanted to ask a final one that's so much about our current state. In the past year, we learned how easily global trade networks can be disrupted. How has COVID-19 impacted your industry and in this globalized world? Marygold, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, in some ways it really hasn't, because a lot of times in what we're talking about are these really rural, quite set apart producers, right? And so there are those trade production that's continuing on, and it will continue on, and they'll just sort of wait for markets to sort of open up later on. So I haven't really heard a lot about the disruption with COVID, because these communities are so remote to begin with. But I do know Bolivia really has locked down very strongly. And so more in the urban areas, there's been really a lot of concern about that. But I haven't really been hearing a whole ton of disruption, again, because it's possible for them to rely on some of these mutual aid networks for labor and not need to rely on the migrant labor in such circumstances.
Thank you. Stuart?
One of the places where COVID has come up, like quinoa, is labor a little bit, and perhaps even more so, I would say, and particularly again for countries which rely on international workforce to harvest their coffee. I understand that in Colombia, that on a lot of farms, coffee has been left unpicked on trees because they can't get the labor. Because of quarantine restrictions, they just can't get the labor onto the farms in order to deal with the harvest. And say, unlike, I'm not sure how quickly quinoa needs to be harvested, but coffee, there's a limited amount of time you can harvest it before it's not commercially viable anymore. So this has been a problem.
Anarita, do we see issues in cacao production?
Yes, when the pandemic hit, it was the largest crop picking of cacao in Mexico and throughout the continent. So the movement of this crop was quite difficult because of the lockdowns in one hand. And on the other hand, technical assistance, for example, all the projects of the NGOs that were going to different towns, both in the Pacific coast and in the Atlantic coast, they couldn't reach the towns because they were closed to anybody coming from the outside. So we are very concerned again about the diseases, because throughout all this season, perhaps they have been neglected, cacao plantations, and moniliasis, as Stuart and Marygold know, is a disease that has to be continuously taken care of. You just can't leave it to chance. So that's the concern, movement of cacao production and then the closure of towns.
Thank you. Moving to the questions in the Q&A, and please continue to feed questions. We have many. This question is for you, Stuart. This is from Javier Ponce de Leon, who mentions that the regions that currently grow coffee, and as we mentioned, they're going to be affected by climate change. He wonders if new regions will actually be adequate for production with this change, and what are the soil weather characteristics associated with them? I think, Anarita, you mentioned a bit of that in your talk, and the question is in particular for you, Stuart, with regard to coffee.
The turn of phrase that people in coffee use is they say coffee is moving up the mountain. That is, as you know, coffee is largely a crop of mountains, particularly Arabica coffee, and it likes temperatures of an average of 21 degrees centigrade, probably with a reasonable fluctuation, high of 28, low of 16. It's really nice, actually. But as temperatures warm, essentially that average moves up the mountain. And so coffee is going out of production in the lower altitudes and being replaced by cacao, by Robusta coffee, and by other crops. And so if you did look at that map on the last bit of my slide, there were some areas in green that tend to be the higher parts of the mountain that perhaps historically were too cold to grow coffee, that are becoming more and more suitable for coffee. But then again, all you need to do is think about these shapes of mountains to realize that even though some areas are going to be coming into production that will be more suitable for coffee, the total area is likely to be smaller. And of course, we have to ask ourselves what is currently being produced in those places and what agriculture might be displaced as coffee moves up the mountain. I can't speak in great detail to the soil and weather characteristics other than just what I was saying about sort of the temperature and rainfall that I was talking about before. Thanks.
Not surprisingly, from a highly caffeine dependent sphere, coffee is bringing in a lot of the questions. So I will try to intersperse them with several of the others. There was a let me just go here before. From Maisie Luo, she wanted to know, how do we rebuild a healthier relationship, again, with coffee, as part of a decolonial movement while living in a fast-paced capitalistic environment? Although I think this question could be applied to all of the crops that we mentioned. Stuart?
I would kind of like to throw this one to the team, because I think this is a collective question for all of us. And particularly, I'd love to hear what Marygold has to say about this, because I think there are, well, both, any of us, I mean, capitalism, for better or worse, is what makes, what enables them to grow coffee and connects them with us. And I think some of the various certification initiatives, some of the fair trade initiatives, some of the organizations that seek in one way or another to empower the producers in this relationship so that they're not just price takers, are really important. And I would say here too, the development of things also like direct trade coffee, which is not just a relationship between producer and consumer, but also importantly between the roaster and the global north, has been offered as a kind of more humane, decommodified model of capitalism. So I think there's a lot of really, really creative and interesting work going on, which is, I think, in no way undermines the broader, perhaps, critiques of some of the sort of underlying economic fundamentals, which still remain deeply problematic. Like even the price of specialty coffee is to a large extent tied to those commodity prices, which are still highly volatile.
Oh, very interesting. I have a question from the Q&A for Anarita. Anarita, this is from Ali Wist, and I'm going to couple that with another question. I'm curious if Anarita would give one or two examples of biocultural relationships that chocolate has with other systems or non-humans that is problematized once it is decontextualized. So it was one question. And from Iris Yellum, she studies India, and she was wondering if you knew a little bit more if there is a chocolate trade emerging in India, and if you could say a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, thank you. Answering the first question, if you take it out from its original place, which is Mesoamerica, the reason I talk so much about bioculture is because we are now appreciating more than ever agroforestry systems and the combination of different crops. Not only in order for subsistence, but also for commercial purposes. So there are two very good examples in Mesoamerica, which are cacao plantations, which have this combination of many different elements that play a part in gastronomy throughout the centuries, and also the traditional milpa, which is the way corn has been grown for many centuries and still does in Mesoamerica and Latin America, which is not a monoculture like we see in many other regions, but a diverse crop that grows with everything you need for sustenance. So when you decontextualize this, as it had happened throughout the centuries when cocoa traveled south and then traveled west in the cocoa belt around the world, it became a monoculture, an open sun. I don't know if you can say this in English, an open sun culture without the shade of the trees and seeking for higher yields. And then, well, the vicious circle of climate change, etc. And thinking about India and thinking about the second question and why you tie them both together, Gabriela, and I think the next frontier for cacao, as we might all know, and if we follow this boom and bust tendency that Stuart very well explained and that happens to cacao and to coffee, it's just a matter of time before disease and other crises hit Africa. So I think that the next place where cocoa is gonna thrive in this idea of a commodity trade is gonna be in Asia. So I don't have the numbers in my head, but I think Indonesia is the first cacao producer in Asia. And then I think New Guinea, and then somewhere around there goes India. Of course, humongous country with many, many consumers. And we also have to consider that there's a humongous market growing of middle-class chocolate consumers in India and also in China. So it's like the perfect scenario. I don't know how it's going to move there. Ideally, agroforestry systems, and I am not aware of how it's being developed in India, but I think by now we all know that that's the path to follow. So I think that's the way it's going to be.
Wonderful. We have many questions and we have about 15 minutes left, so I'll try to get through many of these as possible. The next question is for you, Marygold, and this comes from Eric de la Barrera, and he's asking, how can we keep this balance between sexifying local foods, but still preventing their complete gentrification? I'm thinking about quinoa becoming much more profitable for export than food security, but also avocados and tequila.
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, there was a real big concern whether the higher price of quinoa would mean that it would price out a lot of the consumers in Bolivia, for instance. And some research has really suggested that's not too much of the case because of the way that it was associated with indigeneity as a comida del indio. It wasn't sexy, as they say, for local consumers ever. So they weren't eating it before. So it's not that they've shifted away from quinoa, but it is true that you can get quinoa now in so many more places, even though the price is much higher there. But you do see actually in rural areas among the producers themselves, in rural areas, they're eating actually a lot more of it because maybe it has become sexified elsewhere. But even the rural producers who they ate it for subsistence before, but it wasn't something that they would choose. They liked to eat wheat, actually they liked to eat noodles and rice in particular, but there was a shift back to that. But I don't know the answer to that is, except that providing a lot more income for rural folks has, I think, had a much bigger impact on food security in those areas than having the price of quinoa go up. Although it is true, you know, the Bolivian government tries to do in a school food, bring quinoa into school food, and there's been some difficulties because the price is so high that the government is even being kind of priced out of that as well. So I don't really know how to get that balance.
Thank you so much, Marygold. I'm going to pair two questions, sections of these questions for all the panelists. The first one is from June Ehrlich, who's asking this very interesting question about competition from low-wage countries. She's thinking here in particular about coffee and chocolate, but if the panelists could address what that looks like on the ground. And I wanted to also include the question from Santiago Mota, together with that question. And he's also asking for the three panelists, could you speak a bit more about how global demands have affected the biodiversity of each of the crops and what is being done in the front lines to secure ancient varieties and agricultural knowledge and indigenous practices? Who would like to go first?
I can speak to that. I think that's a really interesting question about sort of biodiversity because during the colonial period and since then, quinoa was so marginalized and it was only grown for subsistence. We owe a great debt to the husbanding of these crops, the conservation of the biodiversity. We owe a great debt, especially now that as we're imagining and kind of rethinking of quinoa as this potential climate smart technology that will save the whole world in terms of its food security. So we do owe a really great debt there. And it's interesting now that the people who are doing this genetic research really go back to and try to find these most traditional varieties. Sometimes they look at the wild varieties that are kind of at the edges of these fields and production. And I think that that's absolutely important. Quinoa was never a monocrop the same way, or for extensive periods of time, the way that other crops were. So there still is this incredible diversity. But we have to remember that the only reason that we have that is that marginalized communities, really excluded communities, husband did that. And so I think there was a question earlier about kind of how do we decolonize or think about a decolonial food system. And as we go forward with quinoa, for instance, one of the things that you can think about as you start to look at the genetic features is you can think about adapting or manipulating the quinoa genome for traits that will support smallholder type production as opposed to large scale industrial production. And here's an example. One example is that on the exterior of the quinoa seed is what's called saponin. It's like it can wash off easily with water, or you can grind it off like you grind off rice, but it's an expensive step in the production process. Subsistence producers have always managed to find ways to take care of that at the low level for their own needs, but it's a really expensive step in kind of the commodifying step there, right, and the industrialization of it. And so one of the first, so these people who are doing the genetic research on it, they say that they want to have kind of build the climate adaptability of it, so looking at drought tolerance and saline tolerance. But the first location, the first gene that they identified was ways to make a sweet variety, which really is really oriented towards industrialized large-scale monocrop production of this, right? And so if you focus on those kinds of genetic possibilities, then it's not going to be a decolonial kind of a process. But if you focus instead on some of those other ways that might support smallholder interests and the ways in which smallholders might engage with the crop, then you might be able to think about kind of decolonizing approaches to this.
So I'm just mindful of the time, and I'd like if maybe we could keep. There's so many great questions in the Q&A, and maybe we can address the questions on Anarita and Stuart, so we can get maybe a couple more from the chat.
So, do you want me to follow up? Okay.
Yes, please.
I'll just follow up and say the history of coffee in the Americas is almost exactly the opposite, that coffee came to the Americas breathtakingly genetically impoverished. It's extremely, extremely narrow basis. And what happened in the 1960s is the FAO, a bunch of collectors from the FAO went to Ethiopia, which is the center of diversity for Arabica coffee, and took it to gene banks around the world, including to one in Costa Rica, Brazil, India, and elsewhere. And then in recent years, an organization called World Coffee Research has basically started breeding, introgressing wild Arabica DNA into cultivated Arabica. And they're also doing other things along the line of what Marygold was talking about, also breeding coffees for small producers working in agroforestry systems, as well as for people working in intensive full sun systems as well. All of this is still very embryonic. It's just probably a decade old, but it represents a big shift in both in coffee breeding and what the breeders are intending to do and who they're intending to do it for. So I think I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you. Anarita?
Yes, well, I agree with both Marygold and Stuart, but I think this is a very delicate balance between keeping biodiversity and native species and actually coming up with new genotypes that, as I was saying before, are disease resistant and higher yield. At least that's the debate in the cacao world, and particularly in Mexico, where all genetics or criollo varieties, I was saying, have become like the holy grail, you know? So people are trying to find in the most remote places these genetic versions of cacao that promise better flavors. Now, the balance I'm talking about is, of course, economic. I think you were asking something also about the competition between lower prices. So how do we make it profitable for producers of cacao and of coffee and of quinoa to thrive in a diverse system, agroforestry system, in the case of cacao and coffee, and still have good profitability margins and a reasonable livelihood. So I think this balance is very delicate, and we're faced in the next few years or in the next decade with making this happen in all three crops.
Thank you so much. From Leida Fernandez Prieto, I would like to know if there is a concern on the part of political, social, economic agents for the recovery of local knowledge and practices through these crops. Why don't we start with you, Anarita?
Government efforts, she said, can you repeat?
Sure. If
Yes.
there are the recovery of local knowledge and practices of these crops from political, social, or economic agents. So, yes.
All three of them. I think this effort is actually being done, particularly in terms of cacao. And since it's a crop that originally comes from Mesoamerica, we're banking on this idea of culture and of identity. So both NGOs and in this new government regime in Mexico, huge efforts are being done to ennoble the origins and the cultural practices, which are not only something from the past, but actually something that coincides with the need for agroforestry systems and bioculture conservation.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I will read another question and I will allow you to choose which one you would like to answer. This one is from David Meyer, and he's asking, for all panelists, consumers in the global north pay very little for these crops. What contributions, advocacy, financial, philanthropy, etc., might engaged consumers make to promote improvements in the economic returns to farm households and or help them build up greater capabilities to foster biodiversity? So Stuart, Marygold, you have the option of one of those, and Anarita will turn back to you in our remaining 5 minutes.
I'll just say that fair trade, even though it has its own problems, fair trade has been a really important way to making sure that farmers in kind of where quinoa has come from and the original farmers get a better wage. And so you can know when you go to the fair trade, if you buy fair trade quinoa, that you're purchasing from the farmers in highland Bolivia around the Salar region. Peruvian, it's kind of odd, but Peruvian quinoa actually in the lowlands is what's the most industrialized monocropped production. It never grew in the lowlands before this, but it really supporting those highland producers through fair trade is one of the things that you can do.
Great, thank you, Marygold. Stuart?
I think I would say something similar, again, fair trade, and there are some other certifications like Smithsonian bird friendly, which are kind of like, which have labor and environmental and other standards. There's almost too much to choose from, but I think the other thing, and I really appreciate David's question, is it also, I think, points to a larger issue, is that it's in some ways hard to shop your way to social justice. And I know that there's a lot of consumers who would really like to do more, but we can certainly do a lot and make lives better for many people. But this is a bigger problem than can be solved through purchasing, which is not to say don't do it. Please do it. But I'll leave it there.
Anarita?
It's a tough question. And I think one of our concerns is that although all of these certifications are very necessary and an excellent step in for fair trade, they all come from the global north. So it's hard to, keep going this colonial way of production and of commerce. On the other hand, I think that they reach a very limited amount of the population. So maybe they will reach from, again, the global north, and in the global south, let's say, just a very few people are going to be aware of fair trade and how it's getting to the producers in all these places and how it's helping with biodiversity. So it's a language of the few, not of the most. So we have to find a way of communicating to all of the consumers in the world. And I don't know how to say this, but as long as these crops remain a commodity, it's going to be very difficult. And it's still going to be a market niche of fair trade and certified things that don't reach everybody.
Thank you so much, Anarita. And with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I wish to especially thank each one of our panelists, Anarita, Stuart, and Marygold, for really terrific presentations. And I want to retake this image that Anarita had in her presentation about flavor and how flavor can give us a whole new outlook into the world, and thinking about these commodities with their interrelated labor and climate change issues, but also how flavor ties us all in a united world to find better solutions to the problems that we're facing today. Thank you all, and have a good evening.